Dan, right where we ended our first show together, I had wanted to ask you about this journey, your own journey through the regrets, through the study, and surely it altered your own perspective on your life, your habits. I want to hear how it influenced you.
Well, in a lot of ways, you know, I think the biggest specific one, Kevin, was on these connection regrets. I was someone who is not typically very good at reaching out, and there's something about hearing all of these stories over and over again about people who didn't reach out and then regretted it that really changed me. And so for me, sort of, if there's a habit, it's that if I'm ever at a juncture whenever I'm at a juncture where I say, okay, should I reach out or should I not reach out? I've discovered that simply be arriving at that juncture answers the question.
Yeah.
That if I'm there, then the answer is reach out. So when in doubt, reach out. So that's changed me, and that's not something that I've done a lot of in the past. I was always someone who actually bought the idea completely wrong that other people I interviewed bought, which is that, oh, if you reach out, it's going to feel awkward, and if you reach out, the person you're reaching out to isn't going to give a darn. And those are both deeply erroneous assumptions.
Yeah. Well, when you look at those areas, it's worth doing my habit show a little bit differently here because you have these areas. So you're talking about the connection regret on that. With let's go to the foundation regret,
Yeah.
the aspects of stability. When you hit that, did it bring up any areas of, man, I want to bolster something in that, or did it give you the gratitude that I'm so grateful I've been doing X, Y, Z?
Yeah, you know what? That's an interesting one because on that one, I think that's the category in which I have the fewest.
Okay.
And I think that's because I've generally been a pretty, just in my like sort of personal financial health life, I've been pretty like prudent and conservative. On that, I tend to exercise and eat reasonably well. I've always been like actually pretty almost absurdly frugal in a way. So I haven't had as many of those. I think the big takeaway for me though, Kevin, is recognizing that with foundation regrets, it's not for some people. It's not entirely on them. It's not on them, but it's not entirely on them. Let me
Okay.
give you an example.
Yeah.
If I have a 35-year-old who says, "Oh my God, I haven't been able to save any money," and I learned that 35-year-old was a first generation college student who graduated from college $150,000 in debt. Okay, that's not totally on you. That's not about, it's not like you were earning a decent salary and spending it all on sports cars and fancy restaurants.
Right.
So it made me think differently about that. But I have fewer foundation regrets largely because I'm prudent, frugal, and conservative in my
Well,
personal
what
life.
I want to ask you. So I had you on 2.5 years ago. Last time we talked about your book, When, which I do want credit for. That's it right
Yeah,
there.
no, it's
When,
fantastic.
and
I'm sure it's there. I'm sure it's there all the time too.
all the time. And so is Drive. It's right there too.
Yeah.
So, and as soon as we're done, I'll put the new one up there.
Oh,
So,
nice.
okay. I'll give a whole shelf to Dan Pink books, gratefully.
Sure.
Well, but on that, so 2.5 years on the aspect you mentioned, exercise, so physical nutrition. I often ask people what they're doing. Anything changed, if not from the book and the regrets and looking at that, just from your own habits that you've implemented some new things, or are you pretty much doing what you were before?
I think that I'm pretty much doing what I did before.
Do you
Um,
subscribe to any specific diet or exercise regime?
Not really. For diet, I tend to be. This is totally unexciting, but I'm not a vegetarian or a pescatarian or a vegan or anything like that. I eat pretty much everything. The one thing that I have, uh, I tend to. This might be a change. I tend to really avoid sugar now.
Yeah.
After everything that I've read about how much extra sugar there is in all these in everything, so I tend to avoid additional sugar, and I look at labels and things for sugar. I try to eat whole foods rather than processed foods as much as I can, and I do go a lot of the way toward avoiding sugar. I was pretty persuaded by some of the research
Yeah.
that sugar might be a much bigger devil than fat. Fat was the big devil for 25 or 30 years. and I actually think that sugar, particularly refined sugar, is bad. So I avoid that. Um, on the non-health stuff, well, I mean, in the pandemic, I it was a great thing, and in the pandemic, I bought a treadmill,
Oh, excellent.
and I might be the only person on the planet who actually likes running on a treadmill. At some level, I prefer that to running outside because I live in an urban area. So when I run outside, you got to watch out for traffic. You
Yeah.
got to watch out for. I've actually my left pinky finger is crooked because I fell once running because the sidewalk had buckled. I didn't notice it, and I fell and just completely destroyed my finger. So I have a treadmill downstairs, so that's a habit there. I think I've done. I don't know whether I was doing this, Kevin. If you can see this, your listeners won't know, but I'm showing
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
a picture of my office here. Those boxes over there.
Yeah.
Did those? Have you?
Yeah. I
Did you
see.
see those last time?
No.
Okay, so what I do there. This is an interesting thing. I mean, I think it's interesting. So a lot of times, like I think one of the interesting one of the ways for one of the things that I have to try to work out over time is, I want to be intensely focused on what I'm doing now,
Yeah.
but I don't want to lose sight on like what I might do next, other kinds of projects. And so for me, and it's very hard for me to multitask. I'm not a very good multitasker. It's very hard for me to work on like 6 projects at the same time and shift seamlessly. I'm more of kind of a monotasker where I work on one big project at one time, but I'm inevitably my thoughts will occasionally go to other kinds of projects that I'm working on. And so this technique that I have is I have these for your listeners. I have these bankers boxes. That's uh, I hope people know what that is, but
Yeah. Yeah.
you often see them in like in law firms or for
Yeah.
documents and things like that. And each of these bankers boxes out there is labeled with a project that I have in my head, a project that I might be doing next. And so,
Interesting.
but I'm not working on right now. So what'll happen is that let's say I read something, an article or something in a print paper. I will like rip that out and stick it in one of those boxes. Let's say that I think of something. I sometimes scribble a note and stick it in that box. Let's say I hear about a book that is related to that. I might order that book, not even read it, like literally just get it, stick it in that box. And I've
Interesting.
done, and so, and the purpose of that is that when I've gone to look at these things, suddenly it's almost like someone else has been collecting information for me. Because if you just, so like, if I see something, I'm like, oh, I can't deal with this right now, but this could actually relate to this other thing. I just stick it in that box, and then almost like magic, in 6 months, I go into the box and I'm like, wow, who put all this stuff in here? This is awesome. So that's one technique that I do. It's sort of like an analog Evernote in a way.
I was okay. I was just going to go there because I
Yeah,
just last week, or 2 weeks ago, started Evernote for the exact same reason.
yeah,
I have so many resources for so many projects,
yeah.
and I'm trying to do that there.
And I use Evernote too. It's just that there's something about this that I don't know. It's somewhat.
Tactile.
Yeah, it's tactile. It's easier for me. I also do this kind of stuff in I have various kinds of I'll have a lot of Dropbox folders and things like that.
Yeah.
For me, like the big habit when it comes to ideas and projects is to get these things out of your head into a system, out of your head into a system.
Yeah.
And so I have a lot of mechanisms at work to get things out of my head into a system because I'm such a bad multitasker. Like I want to focus on, like on this interview. I don't want to think about 600 other things that I have to do, particularly if 400 of them aren't going to start for a while. But I also don't want to lose a thought, an idea, a resource. And so for me, just having the ability to get things out of my head into a system is incredibly important.
Well, and you're speaking to things that new things, which we talked about in the first show about how that is difficult because your chances for regret, are higher, are so high with those boldness regrets on that ratio. Would you say, even if you've learned to start things, you've written so many books, you've done those, do you fall more on the secure or the stability side or on the taking chances side, the boldness, regret side?
It depends.
Okay.
I actually think that in some level, sort of looking back in my life, I haven't been bold enough
Okay.
because I've been this, just sort of fairly frugal and conservative in how I operate my life. I mean, so for instance, I've been working for myself for over 20 years. I have never had an office outside of my home. I've never paid rent to anybody
Hmm.
else. And that's part because I like low overhead, and I like that frugality, and I think that adds to the stability. But in some ways, these boxes here are at some level. I hadn't thought about it explicitly until you mentioned it. Are in some ways, you know, boxes that will help me anticipate future regrets.
Yeah. Yeah. I like the preparation. So you're back to the foundation
Yeah,
aspect of that. So I'm curious. One of the ones that I often ask about is, the mental habits, the things we do to keep ourselves mentally where we want to be. If I'm correct, and I don't have the book here right with me, but one of the guys I'm having on the show, Ethan Kross, his book,
yeah,
Chatter. I
yeah.
think
Very good
you,
book.
well, I think you wrote something in there. You wrote a testimony
Yeah, yeah. No, it's a very good book.
in there. And so it got me thinking about that, the mental aspect and dealing with you're talking about clutter there. So is that one of the things that you do to help your mental health is declutter, in essence, get rid of the
Absolutely.
chatter? Okay.
I hate clutter. Even though my office doesn't look that neat, it is uncluttered, and I hate clutter. I hate mental clutter. I hate physical clutter. It makes me uneasy. And so, but again, if you just develop these habits to get it out of your head into a system, there are other kinds of things I have something that I call a spark file,
Okay.
where if I have an idea of any kind, most of them are crappy ideas. I have a running long document, and I just write it down there. So let's say I think of like a title for a book. I don't even know what the book is. I'll just put it on there, and then I'll come back to this spark file periodically, and I'll realize when I come back to them that most of these ideas are terrible.
Yeah.
But every once in a while there's a good one on there, that I might have lost if I didn't have a system to get it out of my head and onto this into this capturing tool.
I want to ask on these, as much as I want to hear about you specifically, your personal life and these. Some of that we mentioned on the previous show, we hit on faith-based aspects and
Yeah.
spiritual things. Did that come up much in your research on regrets? Because I don't remember seeing much about it in the book.
There were some.
Yeah.
There were some people particularly who said that they regretted not living as faithful a life as they could have, which I think was a proxy for certain kinds of moral regrets. That
Okay.
is
Yeah.
that maybe they I mean, again, not to over analyze or oversimplify, but they were probably violating some of the Ten Commandments. They were they they were they were cheating on their spouse, or they were lying, or they were doing things that didn't exemplify their faith. There were there's one in the book, I think, of a woman who, but one of many, who her regret was not teaching faith to her kids enough,
Interesting.
and feeling like she let her kids go too far, sort of that her kids didn't have a grounding in faith, and she regretted her inaction of doing that. But at the same time, there were people who regretted. There were not a lot of these in any of these, but there were also people who regretted, say, not leaving organized religion, saying they were brought up in a certain kind of organized religious tradition, and they said, "This is not for me," but they felt ashamed to leave it because it was a betrayal of their family and perhaps a betrayal of God, and it took them a while to reckon with that.
On this vein, I'm now curious on asking a similar question in regards to health, let's say, because that was one of the big ones on the foundational side,
Yeah,
people having regrets
yeah,
for health. So you're talking about, again, this wasn't deathbed regrets. I want to point that out. If you haven't heard of
yeah,
the first show, this is not deathbed regrets. This is a wide swath of people. When they looked at it, whereas people saying, I regret where I have gotten myself to
yeah,
at this point, primarily health wise.
yeah.
I mean, we're in a terrible pandemic of ill health, chronic illness, and disease.
Absolutely. And I think that, again, that's so what you have is, you exactly as you say, Kevin, what you have is you have people who, they almost sometimes use the exact same language. They say, I looked up one day and I was 51 years old and like, overweight and deeply unhealthy. And it didn't happen it happened. It didn't happen immediately. It happened gradually, then suddenly, and like that's a big problem, and that's going
Yeah.
to take a while to undo. Now, but again, if you're 51 and unhealthy, you can do something about that. Again, there's this very cliche Chinese pop proverb that says, the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The second best time is today.
Today, yeah.
And so so if you have some of these foundation regrets about decisions you made earlier in your life that have compromised the stability of your life, it's very hard to undo. You can't correct that fully now, but you can start today to put aside $5 a week. You can start today to every day, not to run a marathon, but to take a walk around the block twice a day. You can do things, and when you feel that pang of regret, remember, regret clarifies and it instructs. It's telling you what you value, and it's giving you teaching on what to do next.
You mentioned for yourself that the connection regret was significant for you or stood out somewhat, family and friends. So, again, in your research here, was there more people regretting? I regret that I have not connected, I have not reached out, I have not kept in touch with people. Was that primary, or was there also maybe some regret of relationships people stayed in?
Oh, interesting. Yeah, there were some regrets about people staying in relationships, definitely. Um, and that's interesting because to me that's almost living at the border of boldness and connection.
Yeah.
That is, a lot of those were really regrets about asserting oneself,
Yeah.
about being true to oneself, about speaking up.
What about so mental is one of the spokes as well, and we know, speaking of chronic illness and disease, anxiety, depression, were there some of the regrets of the mental state people had allowed themselves to stay in, the worry that they had lived in?
So two different things there. One of them is, there were a lot of people, a lot whose regret, it was a foundation regret that they didn't get help, medical help for their mental health problems sooner.
Interesting.
A lot like that. In terms of worry, now worry is interesting because you have, certainly the medical problem of anxiety, and that is um, there are medicines and there are physicians who treat that disorder. I think that for some people, though, things are not fully medicalized because they become medicalized because they don't have a way to interrupt it in their own behavior. And so this is the point about that is, if you ruminate, if you don't know how to deal with negative emotions, it's
Right.
possible that you can tip into a serious mental health problem, a medical problem. But if you have the tools, and especially at a younger age, to deal with negative emotions, to process them, then I think you're less likely to tip into those, medical problems.
Well, and again, I'm going to call people, if you did not hear our first show together, we talked specifically about negative emotions and the power that they can have if done well, not stewing in negativity,
Exactly. Yeah. No,
but
stewing
harvesting
is
them.
stewing is really bad. The problem is that we haven't given people an alternative beyond
Yeah.
ignoring or stewing.
Okay.
And what we need to do is systematically teach people how do you confront these things? How do you reframe your negative emotions? How do you make sense of them?
Yeah.
How do you extract lessons from them?
Finances. Now, you talked about, again, going through this kind of made you grateful for the things that you have done foundationally, financially. But if we look at, again, people's regrets in this area, the spoke in essence, we would think most people are regretting, you've mentioned that they had not saved money, but were there also some on people that wish they had done more to make money? They had, again, taken a boldness risk.
It's interesting. Yeah, most of the boldness regrets were not about making money. They were
Okay.
more about the action itself. Um, um, that seemed to be more common.
Okay.
The foundation regrets on finance were really about prudence, about conscientiousness. The boldness regrets were really about the action itself. People weren't to say, "Oh, I regret I'm not rich." They said, "Oh." They really were saying, "I regret I stayed in this lackluster job because what I really wanted to do was go out on my own, but I didn't have the guts."
Well, and it kind of speaks to that now, to the deathbed regrets. That was an interesting one to me. That a big one was, I wish I had not worked so much. I don't even know if it said worked hard, but so much.
There were a few of those.
Okay.
I mean, actually more than a few, and those were really, to me, those are really about connections because it
Mm,
was the opportunity cost.
right.
The thing is that people weren't and those kinds of regrets, people weren't regretting so much that they spent so much time in the office. What they were really regretting is they spent so much time in the office instead of with people they loved.
Right.
In particular, they spent time in an office that they might not have liked, and that might not have been fulfilling, and that might not have answered the call for boldness. And the sacrifice that they made in doing that was not spending time with people they love. I think that that's what those kinds of regrets are about.
Career. Now, with that one, I'll ask you personally, was that one that you looked at in gratitude for the career pathway that you've taken? And maybe even as we talked about, that aspect of regret can deepen the meaning. That was at a time for you to consider, man, what if I had not done this? What if I had not written that first book?
I don't know how much I've thought about that. I mean,
Okay.
I actually have a decent number of professional regrets, and what I've tried
Hmm.
to do is I've tried to learn from them to
Okay.
do better. I'm trying to make progress and just become a better version of myself, and one way
Yeah.
to do that is to look back and reckon with mistakes that I've made. And the career mistakes that I've made, the professional mistakes that I've made, have generally fallen into two big camps. One of them um, is that I often would enter into, like when I was younger, would enter into projects or whatever, jobs or whatever, with making too many assumptions about what it was really like there.
Hmm.
And not actually doing the due diligence and investigating what it's really like there and assuming I knew more. I mean, again, this is not like the biggest regret in my life, but I think about something like law school. I went to law school, but here's the thing, it's embarrassing. I never visited a law school. I never sat in on a law school class. I never talked to a lawyer about what they did. Like that's ridiculous.
Yeah.
Okay, I just had these assumptions, and then the other thing that I realize in some mistakes that I make, which goes into my monotasking propensity, is that some of my career mistakes, professional mistakes, were because I would agree to do something that I wasn't 100% behind.
Right.
And so I would do it in sort of a half-hearted way, and that never worked. That never works. And so I learned that. Most of my gratitude, though, comes not. I don't think much about gratitude in the professional sense. I think about gratitude in the personal sense a lot.
Yeah. And folks, if you heard him talking about being a lawyer, if you type in Dan Pink TED Talk, yeah, you start off with a story there that it's worth hearing. Matter of fact, yeah, do that. I may put that in the intro. Check out, if you haven't before, Dan Pink TED Talk. And on the career aspect, and you mentioned this a couple times, I think in the first show, that people might have regretted not starting that business or whatnot. But how many regrets were around, maybe not even how much, we talked about that, how much somebody worked, but where they worked, if they stayed in that job, if they didn't start that business? What were the top headlines there?
Well, they're mostly about, I think, taking a chance, answering the what if question, and being true to oneself.
Yeah.
I think that's what mostly they were. They weren't about a particular industry or anything like that. They were really about, you know, um, at some level, I think they were about potential. Like I didn't really test the height of my potential.
Okay. Well, the last spoke that we usually talk about is personal. And I'll
Yeah.
start off asking
And
you.
forgive
Yeah.
me for interrupting here.
No,
I,
no.
I need to go in just a bit to do this other call.
Oh, got it. Okay. Personal. We'll end on that one. So on the personal side, any new habits that you've put in on just the self-care, the play, the fun? Did this pull you, even your regrets focus here, pull you to, I want to invest more in some of these things that inspire me?
Well, as I mentioned the connection regrets and the idea of reaching out. In terms of the personal side, I think that the one thing that I have really begun to, it has nothing to do with regret, is that I found I really like walking, like going out for walks. Like I find myself like sometimes walking like 3 miles a day, sometimes with my wife, sometimes alone, along with doing exercise. I don't consider walking exercise. I consider walking meditation for people who, like me, who can't sit still.
Yeah, I've noticed that as you're bouncing in the seat there.
Yeah.
And hey, thank you, Dan. Thank you. Thanks for coming back. Thanks for sharing your research, sharing the behind the scenes on your own life and the insight. It's inspiring.
Kevin, what a pleasure talking to you. I really enjoyed it.